Bibek Debroy is an Indian economist and author. He has made significant contributions to game theory, economic theory, income and social inequalities, poverty, law reforms, railway reforms, and Indology, among others. He is currently serving as the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister and has served as a member of the Niti Aayog. He was awarded the Padma Shri in 2015. In 2016, he was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the US-India Business Summit. Debroy has authored over 100 books in the field of economics, polity, Indology, and Sanskrit and has translated the unabridged version of the Mahabharata into English. He has also translated the Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavata Purana, the Harivamsa, the Vedas, and Valmiki Ramayana. Rudra Chatterjee is the managing director of the Lakshmi Group and the chairman of OBT. Lakshmi Group is one of the fastest growing and dynamic tea companies in India and Rwanda, while OBT is India's largest carpet company that exports carpets to the United States and Europe and has won numerous Indian and international awards for its social accountability, environment stewardship, and design leadership. Rudra is a graduate of Columbia Business School and has worked as a consultant in the New York office of Booz Allen Hamilton. Let us welcome our panelists today with a huge round of applause.
Different structure to this talk. Dr. Debroy said that we should start with an interaction. So through the interaction, he can make his general observations on the economy, and then we can have more time for questions from you so that we can hear from Dr. Debroy. You of course know who Dr. Debroy is. You've already heard his introduction. He served in many capacities, but most of us probably know him through his newspaper columns, and also through his limericks on different subjects, if not his translations of Mahabharata and Ramayana and the Puranas. So he's a polymath and in tremendous number of subjects. So I was very nervous when I was asked to speak with him, and I hoped that the subject would be only about economics, not about any of the other things he's an expert on. So that I've been promised on. Dr. Debroy, the first question I'd like to ask is, we are in 2020, the subject is about Vision 2020. But let's think about 2000. Before 9/11, before acts of terrorism, before the 2008 financial crisis, we were seeing the tariffs were falling apart. Nations were getting closer. The WTO had set rules which were being followed by countries like India and China. And there seems to be a consensus on how to run the world economy. But now we have Trump in the White House talking about tariff. Boris Johnson won the election in UK and said that he wants to have low taxes but higher duties and will not follow the EU rules. And also in India, while we can talk positively about Make in India, but there's also an impact, an aspect of import substitution, of increasing tariffs, of essentially looking inwards. Can you broadly say what happened in the last 20 years and where will this lead us?
Thank you and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think in the interaction, we should focus a little bit on long-term trends. What's likely to happen in the next 10 years? What's likely to happen in the next 20 years? And the reason I'm mentioning this is it's quite often natural to get focused on the transient, on what immediately attracts our attention in terms of the headlines in the newspapers. The history of what has just been described actually goes back a fairly long time. It goes back to the beginning, to the final years of the Uruguay round of negotiations, and to the formation of the WTO at that time. Even at that time, it was becoming patently obvious, and countries do differ, but let me use the standard terms. It was fairly obvious even at that time that it was the developed countries, the so-called developed countries, which were increasingly becoming protectionist, particularly in the area of goods. Agriculture has all along been somewhat different, but particularly in the area of goods, they are feeling threatened by the emergence of East Asia, by the emergence of China, and in the last few years, even a country like India. So in terms of that polarized world, the developed countries, which had historically, since the formation of GATT in 1948, preached globalization, were now turning anti-globalization. And it was the so-called emerging economies, developing countries, which were increasingly arguing for liberalization. Unfortunately, the multilateral system represented by WTO just fell apart, and no further negotiations have been held thereafter. For the world as a whole, it is always preferable to have a multilateral trading system. Unfortunately, it's fallen apart. Not only have there been no agreements since the Uruguay round of negotiations, the dispute resolution mechanism under the WTO, which is important to resolve trading disputes, that's also now fallen apart. If this happens, there is an inevitable tendency, undesirable though it might be, to have regional agreements. So leave aside who said what now, but this is the broad trend. Ideally, we ought to have a multilateral system. It's not happening. The world is becoming divided into regional blocks, under which you have these protectionist trends, which of course are not desirable. What does it mean for a country like India? There are countries, as we heard towards the end of the last session, there are countries that did very well in terms of real GDP growth rates of 8%, 9%, in an environment where the global environment was somewhat kinder. It was less malign. And now we are talking about India growing in an environment that will be relatively somewhat more malign, somewhat more protectionist, and amongst the various sources of GDP growth, an important one is exports. So that sort of vanishes almost overnight at the stroke of a pen. Just to give some figures as a benchmark so that you appreciate what I'm talking about, there were years, 4 years in succession, when the Indian economy grew at 9% a year. At that time, the export GDP ratio was roughly, it varies a little bit from year to year, so I'm giving you rough ideas, was about 20%. In those years, India's exports in dollar terms grew by 15%. So if we just do the basic maths, the export contribution to GDP growth was at least 3%. So if you take away that 3% from that 9%, you're talking about 6%. So to set that question in perspective, is the world economy is going to be uncertain, if it is going to be somewhat malign, it would be very difficult to attain 9% rates of growth. The aspirational rates of growth, with one qualification that I will add in a minute, the aspirational rates of growth would be of the order of 6.5%, 7%. There are still endogenous sources of growth, because there are several states that have not been growing that fast. I will not mention them, because I get castigated if I mention states. Earlier I used to say that half the states' growth rates are below average. People got very upset, so now I say half the states have growth rates that are above average, which seems to make everyone happy. So there are plenty of endogenous sources of growth, but the bottom line is, despite those endogenous sources of growth, we are talking about 8% or thereabouts.
So one point you made about the world economy, big players becoming more protectionist, and you talked about China, after China entered the WTO, the large economy. And we have seen a lot of that recently with the trade war between US and China. Now, India is another poor economy, not having the same tariffs on India. We did not benefit in exports, like you were talking about exports as one of the sources of GDP, to the nature that Vietnam or Bangladesh have improved, taking market share from China as an exporting country. Is it something in our institution, something in our structure that makes us fundamentally uncompetitive as an exporter compared to these countries?
Let me mention something else first before I react to the question. Whenever one gets into trade negotiations, whether they are multilateral or whether they are bilateral or regional, you cannot expect to get everything that you want without giving up something in return. It's a quid pro quo. You lose a little bit of your independence. And realizing that, you voluntarily enter the trade agreement, balancing the pluses with the minuses. It's a little bit like getting married. You lose a little bit of your independence. And some people prefer to get married, a few don't. So far as India is concerned, in all negotiations, India is likely to gain on what we broadly call services. Because in services, India has had some kind of advantage. And obviously, India is going to lose, as things stand, in manufacturing. So, on balance, when you weigh the pluses and the minuses, if you believe that you are not going to get enough in the area of services, and I will have to yield a lot in the area of manufacturing, then you don't opt for a trade agreement, or at least you don't opt for it immediately, which is what had happened when there was talk of India joining RCEP. Having said that, in manufacturing, the manufacturing GDP ratio in India has been virtually flat for years and years and years. 16% thereabouts, 15 point something, 16, 16.5 thereabouts. There's a long litany of problems documented ad nauseum, and I can repeat them if you wish, of what plagues India's manufacturing. Whole list of problems. And because of those problems, it is historically the case over the last 25 years, 30 years, even before that, that, so to speak, India has lost the bus on manufacturing. However, just to add a silver lining, there is a recent World Development Report that has come out, and it documents what has happened in the area of India getting integrated into global supply chains. And when I read that, I was quite surprised, because it actually does document that India is getting increasingly integrated into global supply chains, except that they are of backward nature, not of forward nature. To state it simply, it's more on the input side, less on the output side. But nonetheless, because the litany of problems is often stated, I thought I should state this silver lining, that if this document is to be believed, then there are indications of some positives, at least in some sectors.
One of the things that is said about our manufacturing, that cost of manufacturing in India, we have a lower labor cost, but there are labor laws which are restrictive. We have a high capital cost. We had a high corporate tax, which has been set right. And because of these three reasons, high electricity cost, if not availability, this differentiates us significantly from East Asia and China. Now, can we talk about some of these individually? And I'd like to just mention one thing when we are talking about, basically we're talking about the cost of labor, the cost of capital, the corporate tax, what difference will it make to make India into a stronger manufacturing economy? Because while it is great to be a, service economy, the kind of jobs that manufacturing brings and the kind of jobs that service brings are different. And I think it's important to be at least even if we are not a service, we might be a service superpower and not a manufacturing superpower, but we must be somewhere in the middle range when it comes to manufacturing. And for that, do you think we are doing enough to get there?
Let's take that in bits and pieces. And I know you're from industry, but nonetheless, I will provoke you a little bit, not you individually. Quite often industry says, look at the high costs of capital in India. I do happen to think that the real price of capital is too high. I also happen to think that as of today, it is really a question of there not being enough demand rather than the price, which is the cost of capital. But that's a transient thing, so let's leave that unless we want to revisit it. Every country has certain factors more in abundance and certain factors are scarce. So having what I have just said about the real price of capital, because India is going to be relatively more capital scarce, the price of capital in India is always going to be relatively higher than the price of capital in other countries of the world. This is a plain economics 101. If you are going to complain that I want the price of capital in a capital scarce country like India to be as low as that in the developed countries, where in some countries now you have defying all norms of economic logic, even negative interest rates, by the same token you should be arguing that I am going to have global wage rates for labor in India. I have never heard industry saying that I also want global wage rates. So I thought I'd make that point. Now on the corporate tax rate, and again I'm not looking at you, I'm looking in this direction. The typical experience for anyone who's in government, especially in North Block, is for industry to come to you and say, please remove exemptions for everyone else, but retain them for me. That way, we will never remove all exemptions. That way, we will never reduce compliance costs. That way, we will never make the tax structure simple. Today, at least on the corporate tax side, we have started to begin the process towards that, except what has happened is companies have been given a choice. Either you retain the exemptions and retain the old rates, or alternatively you give up the exemptions and opt for the lower rate. Obviously it varies from company to company. What has been the net result? Most companies have figured out that it is better to retain the exemptions where you already have a low effective corporate tax rate instead of opting for the other. And while on this, let me mention also this, that as citizens we expect all kinds of things from the government. Let us do some basic maths again. 10% must be spent on infrastructure. I'm talking about public expenditure. 10% must be spent on infrastructure as a share of GDP. China spends 15%, we must spend 10%. 6% must be spent on education, 10 plus 6, 16. 4% must be spent on health, 16 plus 4, 20. 3% must be spent on defense. Defense is important, 20 plus 3, 23. I have not included several other things. What is the tax GDP ratio? It's less than 17% of GDP. 16 odd percentage points. So as citizens, we are prepared to pay 16 to 17% of GDP. Our demands are already 23% of GDP. And I wanted to flag this because the exemptions taken together amount to at least 5% of GDP. So that is revenue that is foregone by the government, but we will want railway stations like in China, we will want airports like in Europe, we will want X, Y, and Z.
Now that's very interesting and I think opens up a lot of issues. And one point you mentioned, I think it's worth discussing the exemptions that industry wants. Take it away from me, but keep it on my competition. It's not just industry. I think there's a feeling of the government being a Mai Baap Sarkar. That has been something that India has always lived with. And is it only the citizens who want a Mai Baap Sarkar? Because the government also does a lot of things, like make biscuits, run airlines on which it makes losses and taxpayers pay. So the government is also very happy to be a Mai Baap Sarkar. And the industry and the citizenry, they also ask for the Mai Baap, looking after from the Sarkar. Yet there are many other things. For example, we spend on loss-making PSUs. But as industry, one of the things that, I've felt, and this is something that has improved a little bit with GST, is where, what we want is if there's a competition between industry and there's people who are not complying and getting, benefits out of non-compliance, that becomes a cost on industry in general. But the broader point is, India seems to be very comfortable with a Mai Baap Sarkar mentality, and this exemption, for my competition and, being free for me is not just for industry, it's for, different castes, different, regions, tax holiday for one region and high tax in one region. That seems, and the government seems to be very comfortable with that, setup, and this has been the case. What explains it and what is the trend? Is it going to increase over time or is it going to decrease over time?
Again, there are several issues that crop up from your seemingly single question. You use the word government, but we need to think about what we mean by government. Because in our structure, we have a three-layered structure of government. There is the union government, state government, and there are local bodies. What is important is a prioritization of resources, because resources always have opportunity costs. So if I have limited resources, I must decide on what to spend them on. And if I take a vote around this room, all of you will have your individual priorities, but we will eventually zero in, I think, in terms of priorities on defense, security, law and order, because that's the primary responsibility of government. And then some areas of physical infrastructure and some areas of social infrastructure, because the private sector will not step in there. Those are our priorities. As a collective entity, have we agreed on those? I don't think we have. And I'm mentioning this because in any country, government, however defined, is representative of the voices of the people. So effectively the MP or the MLA is reflecting our voices, and our voices, I don't think collectively have yet agreed on the need for prioritization, because we want the government to do so many things. One example of that, going back to taxation, is MSME does not pay corporate tax rates. MSME pays personal income tax rates. So if on the corporate tax side, the tax rates have been brought down subject to this choice, on the personal income tax side also, one should bring them down, but that gets stuck. We will have to wait and see what the finance minister does in this budget or later. It gets stuck because of this reluctance on our part to stop enriching chartered accountants and lawyers and agreeing to giving up exemptions. You mentioned public sector enterprises. There are public sector enterprises and public sector enterprises, and several of the loss-making ones are at the state government level. Let me respond only to the central ones and not only to the visible ones like Air India and whatever. The central PSC is the most valuable part of selling of a PSC, and mind you, those loss-making central PSCs are typically loss-making private sector entities which were nationalized, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s through acts of parliament. And I'm mentioning this again because parliament represents our voices, our feelings in an indirect way. The most valuable part of any PSC will be the land. And when I say what I'm about to say, I am surprised that more people don't know about this, that most of the land, the bulk of the land that a central PSC has does not belong to the central public sector enterprise. It belongs to the state government. It belongs to the state government. It has to be returned to the state government. Sometimes it has been obtained from the state government on a lease for a specific purpose. So the most contentious valuation will always involve land. And it is land, some of which is subject to litigation, some of which has been encroached upon, which means that there has to be a timeline for this privatization. It is not, you obviously need to have a figure for purposes of the budget maths, but beyond that, it's not something that you can often do at the stroke of a pen overnight.
But is this for general PSCs or you're talking about railways in particular?
No, I made that point about central public sector enterprises, not so much the railways.
Okay. So you touched upon the budget, and the budget is in a couple of days. My question is not about what is going to be there in the budget, but when you worked with the railways and the railways committee, you said, let's do away with the railways budget. When you represented Niti Aayog for many years, and that did away with the 5-year plan. What is the requirement of a budget?
When you said budget,
The union budget.
you actually meant the union budget. Yes. I personally think we should spend much more of time discussing state budgets, increasingly so, because those public goods and services that I mentioned, most of them will actually be delivered by local bodies, not even state governments. So we should spend much more of time on what state budgets are doing, what state finance commissions are doing, and spend less time discussing the union budget and the union finance commission. What is the broad picture story? The broad picture story is traditionally we have looked upon the budget like the classic Narayan Dutt Tiwari Sindoor budget, the young may not remember, in 89-90, which changed the taxes on Sindoor. So it was called so we look to the budget, is the tax rate going to change? Increasingly we are moving towards a situation of stability where there will be no changes from year to year. Now don't misunderstand what I have said. I have not said we have moved towards that. What is the budget? The budget is about taxes and expenditure. Taxes mean direct taxes or indirect taxes. On the direct tax side, we are in a process of gradually moving towards stable rates without exemptions. I repeat, we have not reached there, but that's the direction we are going. Once it stabilizes, the direct tax rates don't change from year to year. No interest in the budget from that point of view. What about indirect taxes? GST is also work in progress. But once the GST system stabilizes, there will be no changes in indirect tax rates also from year to year. And on GST, let me quickly mention, GST replaced the old indirect taxes, and GST should have been revenue neutral, meaning on an average it should have yielded the same kind of revenue that the old taxes had yielded. And what was the computed revenue neutral average GST rate? 17%. What is the average GST rate today? 11.5%. In other words, in the transition from the pre-GST to the post-GST system, government, and I mean both union and state governments, have actually lost revenue. This is not tenable. But anyway, so taxes will converge. What about expenditure? You are aware that the 15th Finance Commission will submit its recommendations in due course. We will then have some kind of consensus, not because of the Finance Commission's recommendations, but because of what I said about priorities, about what should be the stable scheme of public expenditure. Some of it will be passed on, the divisible pool, some of it will be passed on to states, which is where the discussion happens on state budgets and the state finance commissions. So far as the union part of what is concerned, somewhere down the line, that will also stabilize. Consequently, there will be a time, not in the too distant future, when the finance minister will stand up and say, Madam Speaker, this is the last union budget.
Fantastic. But not this time.
No, as I said, many of these things are work in progress.
Right. So you were talking about prioritization of resources when we were talking about cost of capital. And you said that India has, obviously less capital and so. Now, you've worked obviously on banking reforms over the years and on legal reforms. Now, one thing, and I'm not sure about the data, but I think government is one of the biggest borrowers from banks in India. Not the private sector, not people, but the government as a state entity. And government, and this I think I've heard recently, government is the biggest litigant in India. So it clogs up not only the banking system, but also the courts. So instead of, when we are talking about, reforms of courts and reforms of banks, what can the government do in not, being the, entity that's standing first in line and not letting others through? There was one point in the budget last year which I think did not get followed up, where the government is going to go and borrow from outside the country, from bonds, creating. I was quite pleased to hear it, but apparently it wasn't very popular, because that would mean that they won't crowd out other borrowers, likely borrowers. So what can be done in the legal reform system and the bank reform system, especially in getting the government out? Because most of the litigation, at least most of the litigation that I face as a company, is tax litigation from governments who almost by rote, because the number is more than 50 lakhs, there's a case, you have to appeal. If the number is more than few crores, it goes for an appeal to the High Court or Supreme Court. And no one is really deciding the merit of the case. And it is, it just continues for years. Obviously the lawyers love it, but as businesses we pay for it.
Let me first react to the legal system and then the government as a litigant. I'm dramatizing things a little bit, but nonetheless, we have about 35 million cases stuck in Indian courts. Supreme Court, High Court, lower courts, quasi-judicial forum. And I'm dramatizing it. So if you are going to carry this in newspapers, please be careful that I'm dramatizing it and I'm caricaturing it a little bit. 35 million cases, 70 million litigants. There's a simplification in that, but nonetheless. 70 million litigants. So roughly 1 in every 3 Indian households is litigating. Roughly. That's where I said I'm dramatizing a little bit. Which means that despite Tariq pe Tariq and Damini, a lot of Indians still have faith in the legal system. Otherwise, why should they be going to court? If I look at these cases, 2/3 of them are criminal cases. 1/3 of them, 1/3 is civil cases. It constantly surprises me that we as citizens do not seem to be bothered about the slow pace of dispute resolution in India. Many of you work in organizations. You are entitled to annual leave. When you go on annual leave, does the organization close down? It doesn't. The Supreme Court is the only place that I know of where it closes down. To me, it seems to be extremely odd. We don't think of the cops going on leave, the police system closing down in a state during the summer because of the individual, but we don't seem to be bothered. Let me leave the criminal side out of it. On the civil side, it is my conviction, and now I am sort of really sticking my neck out. It is my conviction that on the civil side, it is not just the judiciary which is to blame, it is not just the bar and the lawyers who are to blame, it's also the litigant who is to blame. Because the moment the issues are framed in a civil dispute, one side or the other knows that the status quo is good for me. And therefore, there is a vested interest in prolonging the dispute. On the criminal side, let me suggest something that is extremely heretical, and lawyers and judges get very upset with me. I think there was a lot to be said in favor of the jury system. Why? Because if you got a bunch of jurors together, you almost had day-to-day hearings instead of this present system of adjournments. Now let me react to the government as a litigant. On the civil side, criminal side, obviously the government has to be a litigant. On the civil side, government litigation happens in about 46% of civil cases. So far as the union government is concerned, there is a recent initiative known as LIMS. You will not have heard of it because government has not been very forthcoming about disseminating what it has done. LIMS actually enables you to track union government cases. This is just union government, not state government. Union government cases and curb pointless appeals. Curb pointless appeals against lower court judgments. So LIMS is sort of about 3 years old, and those of you who are familiar with personal income taxation and submit returns will probably identify with this, that refunds have become simpler. The so-called bribery that was supposed to be associated with getting refunds should have vanished. Scrutiny appeals have become much more anonymous. The human interface has been reduced, but also to simplify it even further, we need to standardize rates, because as long as we don't, we will continue to have disputes.
So this will be my last question, and then I'd invite for questions from the audience. You made a point about demand for capital having reduced. So it's a chicken and egg problem. Demand for capital has reduced because private investment has probably reduced. And private investment has probably reduced because consumption has reduced. So where do you think the solution to this is?
Again, I'd like to distinguish the purely transient from the slightly longer term trends. In the purely transient sense, there is still excess capacity in some sectors. So if there's going to be excess capacity, there is no particular reason for investments. However, there are signs that in some sectors investment is now recovering. And therefore, it is my view that give it another 6 months, and you would not have asked this question, or if you had asked that question, it would have been a little bit more nuanced. The financial system which you alluded to has several dimensions. So fixing the financial system in its entirety will take a little bit longer. But so far as the investment cycle recovering is concerned, I think if you give it just 6 months, the nuance of the question will change a little bit, and give it another 6 months and we will get less fixated by a growth trajectory number of 5%, and we will recognize that the growth trajectory number is not 5, it is 6. We should still debate it, but we should debate it around 6%, not around 5.
That's good news. Questions? Lots of questions.
Good morning. This is Joydeep Soor here. I wanted to ask you just 2 questions, very brief questions. Very rightly so, you mentioned that there's been a flat manufacturing. As Chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Government of India and to the Prime Minister, we would like to know your thoughts as to what the government is doing to pep up the manufacturing side of it. Second, your prediction from 4.8 at the end of, let's say, the March 31st, 2021, what would be your predicted GDP rate of growth? Thank you.
Let me answer the second question first, because the first question has a graded response. The second question, this year we will end at about 5%. And by the way, all these figures that we are tossing around, they are real rates of growth. But sometimes what is much more pertinent is the nominal rate of growth, which depends on inflation. The government's revenue, tax revenue, is much more contingent on nominal rates of growth than real rates of growth. So this year we are talking about 5%. Next year, which is the one part of the question, I would say somewhere between 6 to 6.5. And I mentioned this band earlier also because I think we are on that 6 to 6.5% band. So next year would be 6 to 6.5. The first one, I'm the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, not the government, to the Prime Minister. My advice is for the years of the Prime Minister, not for the years of everyone present here. Nonetheless, I will respond to your question, but I'm just qualifying my answer. Now, so far as manufacturing is concerned, there is a whole list of issues. And do realize, manufacturing does not happen in Delhi. Manufacturing does not happen in the NDMC area or the Lutein zone. Manufacturing happens in states. So many of these problems are problems that can only be resolved at the level of the states. And many of these areas under the 7th schedule of the Constitution, They are either in the state list or they are in the concurrent list. Now, if you look at the listing of various issues, capital in some sense we have already talked about. Labor, he tried to drag me into that controversy. I didn't duck it. I didn't have time. So far as labor is concerned, labor is on the concurrent list. And depending on how you count, there were about 54 different union statutes on labor. These have now been codified into 4. So compared to 54, 4 is better. I'm not suggesting for a minute that 4 is ideal. We can streamline it even further, but right now it has gone to 4, and he will accept this, that it is extremely, extremely desirable that the Plantation Labour Act has now been repealed. I'm just citing this as an example. So far as land is concerned, land is entirely in the state list. So resolving what is going to happen in land is a much more complicated process, but some titling, updation of records pushed by the union government has begun to happen. So work in progress, but eventually what will happen is you will have a number attached to every property, so to speak, so that all records become transparent, real time. But that's work in progress. Do remember that there are states in India where the last cadastral surveys go back to 1908. There are issues connected with forest clearances, environmental clearances. You are familiar with what DIPP has been pushing as the doing business indicators, not the World Bank one, which has led to states making many things self-certified, online, etc., etc. So there are several things that have happened, and I already mentioned some indications of manufacturing improving in terms of what I said on supply chains.
I think we have no more time for any more questions. Last question. I think we can go offline and then.
Sir, you are aware of the state of the Indian economy is falling. This unemployment is rising.
Sorry?
State of the Indian economy is falling. The unemployment rate is rising. Food price inflation is rising. Do you think the government is doing enough to address these issues, or is more busy on something else, which is creating a rather unrest in the society?
Is that a comment or a question? It sounded to me like a comment. So far as the question is concerned, the question seemed to be, am I aware of what is happening in the economy? I should hope so.
Thank you very much. Please take all the questions offline. I hope Dr. Debroy would be. But it was a great pleasure. We have a full house on a weekday. Thankfully, the weather's been great. But it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Debroy. This is wonderful, CCA. Thank you.